RI Academy Podcast One Student, One Creativity. RI Academy Podcast One Student, One Creativity.
Hello everyone, good afternoon. So today we have a podcast about journey of TMD. So I will introduce my name. I am Ayu Febiola as a host for today's podcast. So as you can see here, we have a special guest, Rita Jana. Please give applause to our special guest for today. Okay, not only that, we also have a special theme behind the scene. So we have the first one, Anissa Nurulestari as a video maker, and the second one is our editor, Ana Rahmini. So let's start our podcast for today.
Okay.
Say hi. Hi Mbak Jen for today.
Oh, hi Ayu. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm very delightful here, and I do really appreciate you try to invite me in this podcast.
Okay, thank you so much. Let's talk about our journey in teaching material development or TMD course. We will first start with introduce the fundamental of TMD. Jana, can you share to your initial thought when we first start diving into the course material?
Okay, sure. When we first started, I was a bit overwhelmed by the idea of creating teaching material from scratch. There's a lot of theory to be considered, like how align material with learning objectives and the students' need, and the various teaching strategies, of course, and the effective learning itself inside of the classroom. But over time, I've realized it's not just about the creating a very creative content. It is also about how we engage the students with the creative resources that truly help us as the teachers to be very engaged in our teaching and learning process with our students. And one of the things that stood out to me was how important it is to adapt the material to the learner's needs. I highlight the learner's needs. Why? We have to think about their background, the students' learning style, and even the media we use, and the technology, of course, like the digital tools or print materials. It's all about making sure the student can connect with the content that we possibly already created before.
Okay, I completely agree with you. So that a focus on adapting teaching materials so specific learning context has really shaped how I think about developing content. Now, moving on to the one of the most interesting part of our journey, analyzing case study. In our class, we work on analyzing different case study, and I think that where the theory start. To meet the real world, right? So, do you remember any case study that left a lasting impact on you?
Yes, it is very exciting when we talk about the case study. Yes, one case study that particularly stuck with me was about classroom setting, where the traditional teaching method were not working well for the group of the students. We had to analyze what's wrong, and we figure out how to adapt the teaching approach to address the challenge, whether the traditional teaching method really doesn't work to help the student engage inside of the classroom. Now we can see the new paradigm of the technology incorporating in our teaching and learning process. So that's why there are a lot of phenomena about that, and we try to analyze how to see this phenomenon to be very useful later in the future while we constructing the teaching strategy incorporating the technology itself.
Okay, so those case studies really open our eyes, right? So how the theory translate into practice. Speaking of that, one of the most exciting part of this course has been creating our article, right? And now even working towards writing a book about the podcast that we do right now. And it's fascinating because we are combining both our academic journey and then more creative outlet. So Jana, tell us more about our article writing experience. How did we approach that process?
Yeah, before we started to create or to write the book that we have already created and we just have finished the books, we start to write an article.
Yes.
It was very interesting experience of mine because we had to balance academic rigor with a more conversational tone to engage a wider audience. We started by reviewing a literature on the topic, which gave us a solid foundation. Then we focused on analyzing how podcasts can be used in education. It's very interesting because podcast is very rarely to be used in nowadays.
Yes.
But maybe starting from us, we try to introduce how creative, how enjoy the students if they integrated podcast to be learning and then involved in learning process. I mean here.
Okay, I see we are the same page. I kind of agree with you, because nowadays we always listen podcast, especially maybe like my habit. I always listen podcast in the morning,
That's
just
very
like
great, right?
before start my day. I always listen some podcast, like something entertaining for us. So let's continue. I remember about the process. It was challenging, right?
Yes.
But at the same time, it was so rewarding. And now we are talking in the step further by working on creating a book about podcasts.
Absolutely.
This is where things get really exciting. We are going to delve deeper into the role of podcasts in teaching and learning. It's such an innovative way to share knowledge, Jana. So what can our listener expect from the upcoming book?
Okay, when we talk about our book is going to dive into how podcasts can enhance the teaching and learning process, especially in language education. We'll explore how educators can design effective podcast-based lesson and how students can use podcasts as learning tool. We also include real-world case studies, research findings, and interview with podcast creators who have made an impact to the educational space. I think what's special about this book is that it's not just about for teachers, but also for the students. And anyone interested in learning more about how podcasts can change the way we approach education. It's going to be very comprehensive resource for anyone, of course, and looking to explore the intersections of media in learning.
Okay, sounds great. But I think we need a break time for a while. After that, we will back for the good topic. So please stay tuned and see you, everyone.
See you.
RI Academy Podcast, one student, one creativity. Hi guys, how's the podcast? Please don't go anywhere and stay tuned because our podcast is both exciting and very inspiring. So please stay tuned.
Okay, what do you think about the podcast, guys? Hopefully you enjoy the podcast and get the knowledge. Please don't go anywhere. Stay tuned because we'll be right back after this.
RI Academy Podcast, one student, one creativity.
Okay, welcome back to our podcast. Hello. So let's talk about the books. I'm so excited to see how the book turns out, and I think it's going to be a great resource for educators and learners alike.
Yes.
Podcasts are such a fertile and engaging medium, right? And I think we're really tapping into something powerful here.
Okay. Definitely, my advice would be always keep the learners at the center of your teaching materials. Of course, we try to see the learner become the student center, but instead of asking them becoming the student center, as the teacher, we have to guide them. So in here, it is easy to get caught up in the theory and forget that the end of the goal is to make learning more effective and engaging for the student itself. And also, here, when analyzing case studies, don't be afraid to think outside of the box. Some challenges, some traditional method that we have faced, we have to see a very wider chance when we jump into the real phenomenon to find out a real solutions. That's the problem why we have created that things, and there will always a room for innovations, improvement in teaching. We'll see the magic happen later on.
Okay, I love that advice. So I completely agree with you, and thank you for sharing for insight
Yes.
today. It's been absolutely pleasure to talking with you. I think that's all about our podcast today.
Thank you so much, Ayu. It is such an honor for me to have you and I having a podcast in here to share what I am thinking of, and it's such a pleasure for me.
Okay, so I think that's all for our listener for tuning into the episode The Journey of TMD. So we hope you enjoy this podcast, and I hope you will get some insight for today. I will close this podcast and see you in the next podcast.
Bye-bye.
Bye everyone.
RI Academy Podcast, one student, one creativity.
And how about the video? I hope you got insight from that.
How was the podcast, everyone? We hope you gain a lot of inspirations and knowledge from it. RI Academy Podcast, one student, one creativity. RI Academy Podcast, one student, one creativity.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Welcome to the RI Academy Podcast, One Student, One Creativity. So I'm Sabrina, your host for today's podcast, and there is Ula Rizky Ramadia as a guest for our podcast today, and there are Amelia Kurniasari as a videographer and Nurul Solihatun Dina as a video editor. I am so excited about this. Because we'll dive into a unique intersection of teaching material development, the case study method, and the journey of creating a reference book about using podcast in English language teaching. Joining us is none other than one of the authors of Enhancing English Learning Through Podcast Innovative Approaches for the ELT Classroom, Ula Rizky Rahmadia. Ula, welcome to the show.
Hi, Sabrina. Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here, and also I am very grateful to share my experiences with you and also the listeners of this podcast.
Okay, the pleasure is all ours, Ula. Let's start with your journey as a student in a teaching material development class. How did you manage to use case studies as a learning method and incorporate them into your project?
That's a very great question. It was both challenging and also rewarding experiences, because in the class I have the chance to collaborate with my friends, and also I have the chance to deep dive into the case study, which is very interesting because we have different case study each meeting. And also one thing that I still remember up until now is how we made solution for those students in rural areas who have limited access to technology. So it is kind of very enlightening also for me as a future teacher in that kind of settings.
Okay, that sounds intense but exciting, right? How did you approach managing these tasks as a student?
I think that when managing this task, we need a great collaborations between the students because it's a group-based project or a team-based project. So in this teaching material development, we need to have a good organizing too between all the students. So we divide what we need to do. For example, that one student will search about one topic, and then other student will search about the other topic, and then we will gather and do brainstorming sessions together, so we can try to come up with better solutions for the case study.
Oh, it must have been a great learning experiences, right? So, what skills did you develop from working on this the case studies?
Maybe there are two core skills that I am developing or even improving in this class because we learn about case study. So we can try to improve our problem solving skills as well as our adaptive skills. So we need to be adaptable to the situations. We might not have we might not have technology, or we are limited to this technology. So as a pre-service teachers, we need to be ready to face that kind of situations. And then second is the problem solving skills, because we try to come up with the best solutions for all the students as well as the teachers. How can we make the instructional design be feasible or applicable to the students, as well as critical thinking, because we need to do the brainstorming sessions together. So we need to accept like different backgrounds from the students when discussing, or even different opinions of all the students.
Okay, those are invaluable skills, right? Speaking of learning experiences, I know you were also involved in creating an article and a reference book, right? About using podcast in English language teaching. Can you share more about how you manage to do that as a student?
Okay, well, it started with a small idea during one of the classes. So we were very fascinated about how podcasts could be used in language learning. So because of that small idea, we tried to come up with how we can make a better solution for the students as well as the teachers. So we are guided by our lecturers, which are Rita and also Sir Eri, to make a reference book, especially about podcasts and how we can use podcasts to make the students learning better, especially in English subjects.
Oh, that's amazing. What was the process like for you and your team?
Okay, well, the process for me and my team, we first focus on the idea first, what kind of aspects of podcast that we want to discuss more about this book, and also what things that we would like to make. So at the end, we come up with how we can make podcasts be applicable to the students and how they can utilize like limited sources to make podcasts, because it is all using digital technology, right? So now we are in this era, so we need to utilize as much as we can. And maybe like one thing that is very good about our book is how we try to make an approach where the students can use the podcast innovatively, but also feasible in any kind of situations.
Okay, after this, we'll have a short break and keep stay tuned. Okay, welcome back to our podcast. So we are going to continue the discussion about our topic today. Oh, okay. It sounds like a rewarding yet demanding process. Were there any standout moments while working on the book?
Okay, one thing that that might be very interesting to the reader of our book is about how we combine the real life situations to be made into podcasts. So in this book, one of the example is we used a podcast episode in which we give the example about the customer service scenarios, and then we try to make like the tips or the how to do for the participants of role play, so they can do role play in similar dialogues by try to imitating that kind of situations.
Oh, that must have been so fulfilling. Yeah. And then, were there any challenges you faced along the way you make the podcast or the article?
Okay, one of the challenges is how we can balance the theory as well as the practice in that book. So it not only enhancing their own knowledge as the students, but it also can be practical for them to do. And one of other challenges might be how we can try to give the example that really imitate the real life situation. So I think there is two kinds of major challenge that we face during the process of making the book.
Oh, that's interesting. And what was the most rewarding part of the journey for you as a student?
Okay, as a student, one of the rewarding part is actually finishing the book, because we have reached around 200 pages, and maybe later in the future, the teachers can also use this book as reference. So I think that might be very rewarding moment as the students of making this book.
Oh, that's inspiring. Yeah. What advice would you give to other students here who want to explore case studies or contribute to educational resources?
Okay, for advices, I think that we can start by focusing on real challenges that interest us as a students, because everything can be a topic of podcast, right? But maybe one thing that makes it more particular in terms of English learning is how we as the students could be always stay curious and also open-minded to make utilize or to make use of this podcast to become a better sources of students' learning experiences.
Okay, that's such practical advice. And looking to the future, where do you see podcasts and case studies going in the field of English teaching? What do you think?
Okay, I think because we are now reaching the era where we use technology everywhere, so I think that I see this as a continuous innovative or continuous approach that we can use as a teacher. And also now podcasts are becoming more and more personalized and interactive. So I think that it can be one of the way in which students can use podcasts to make their learning better, because as we know that the students might use technology for different purposes. One student might use it for their love of learning. Other student might use it for maybe like they just wanted to know how native speakers speak, or even they wanted to know more about the issue. So I think that it might be possible for the podcast makers to integrate all the topic even only for learning English. So I think this is one of the advancement in technology that we can use podcasts as well as case studies for bridging the theory as well as the practice. So that's all for my advice for this.
Okay, that's such a promising vision for the future. Thank you so much for sharing your journey and insight with us today. And I'm sure our listeners are inspired to explore these methods in their educational journey. That's such a promising vision for the future, Ola. Thank you so much for sharing your journey and insight with us today. I'm sure our listeners are inspired to explore these methods in their educational journey.
Well, thank you so much, Sabrina. It's been a pleasure reflecting on these experiences as well as sharing them with your audiences.
Okay, and thank you, listener, for tuning into the Innovative Learning Podcast. If you're curious about Ula's book, Enhancing English Learning Through Podcast, be sure to check it out and stay curious, stay inspired, and wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
RI Academy Podcast, one student, one creativity. podcast, one student, one creativity. RI Academy 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 Podcast, one student, one creativity.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So, how are you guys doing today? Hope you all keep your early spirit up, lights up. And hello and welcome to the RI Academy podcast, One Student, One Creativity. So today we're gonna be talking about our book titled Bringing the World into the Classroom using podcasts in English language teaching, and how teachers can use podcasts to help their students to become fantastic listeners and learn about different cultures. Here, I'm your host, Ilhana Kunkafif, and today we're having my friend here also as our guest, Ruth Sarai Vasquez Delgado, another student from the Faculty of Teacher Training and Education in Universitas Sriwijaya. I want to thank Sewa, Kim, and Moga Anggia Priya, who are behind the camera and making this possible. So, just want to inform that Ruth, Moga, Sewa, and I edited the book titled Bringing the World into the Classroom using podcasts in English language teaching. For our class teaching material development with the lecturers Dr. Rita Inderawati M.Pd and Dr. Eryansyah M.A. at Ph.D. Today we're gonna be talking about what makes this book interesting. Stay tuned. Alright, listeners, wherever you are, please welcome our guest today, Ruth Sarai Vasquez Delgado. Okay, hi Ruth, and welcome to RI Academy Podcast.
Hello, Ilhan. Thank you for having me here.
Okay, but before we start, I want to tell our audience that even you're not a teacher, and I think there's going to be a lot for you here, because who doesn't want to be a better listener, and also who doesn't want to just learn more about the world.
Yeah, and I think that is something that is great about our book. It doesn't just say, "Hey, use podcasts in the classroom." It also digs in why the podcasts are so effective, and how about you actually use them for our benefit.
Right. Yeah, one of the things that I found really fascinating about the books that there's some research that we highlight about was done by a master student in Saudi Arabia, looking at the impact of podcasts of English language learners, specifically for the beginners, and the results were, I think, very, very interesting, amazing.
Yeah, these studies show that even for people that are just starting to learn English, using podcasts can be really beneficial.
Right.
And it was not just in Saudi Arabia, it also in Jordan, South America, and even here in Indonesia. So podcasts can really help to develop listening skills because, look, think about it. You're hearing natural conversations, you're hearing different accents, and you're getting exposure to how people actually speak.
So I think it's a total immersion. You're just not just like memorizing the vocabulary or from a textbook. You're actually hearing the language being used in a real life situations.
Exactly. And that kind of leads us to one of the points that the book talks about. That is, learning English is not just understanding the words; it's understanding the culture that is behind the words.
So, okay. I can see your points, right? So, in the book, we talk about the English language, global English. So, what's that? Could you explain that?
Sure, Ilhan. Global English it refers to all these different accents, all these different dialects, expressions that are used by native speakers all around the world.
Okay.
So imagine if you only have ever heard one type of English, and you want to talk with someone with a totally different country with a totally different accent. It will be almost impossible to understanding. So this book is emphasizing the importance of exposing learners to as many accents as possible.
Okay, right. Also, I think I love that the book point out the importance of picking podcasts that with a variety of accents. So you're not just getting one perspective of how English sounds, and it also helps you become a more flexible and adaptable listener. That sounds, I think that sounds really great. How do we find the right podcast? Like, how do we know which ones are going to be good for our listeners? Could you answer that after our break?
Of course.
All right, okay, guys. I just asked Ruth about how we can find the right podcast. Like, because sometimes it is difficult to find one that really helps.
Yeah, well, the book has this section called Key Criteria for Selecting Podcasts, and we talk about that. So according to Moga, it's important to choose podcasts that are appropriate for the listeners' levels. So you don't want to overwhelm them with something that is too difficult for them. Okay. But you also want to pick podcasts that covers topics that are interesting and engaging, because who wants to listen to something boring, right?
Right.
And another important thing is clarity of the audio, because there is nothing worse than trying to listen to a podcast and you can't, because the voices, like, you cannot even hear that voices. So that's another thing. And it's not just that. We need to look to the type of podcast, how fast the host talks, if there are transcripts available, and a lot of more things. And we talk about these things in the book.
Okay. But let's imagine, let's just say that we have some great podcasts. Like, how do we make sure we're actually getting most out of them?
Well, you don't want to just hit play and sign out, right? You want your students to engage with what they are learning. So the book has something that talks about different techniques to active listening, and this is called preparing the ground.
Preparing the ground. Okay, I think I like that song. That sounds good.
Yeah, well, you wrote that part, right? So the book recommends that maybe we can create vocabulary list or brainstorming questions about the topic, or even you can ask the students to write about what they already know about the topic. It's all about setting the intention on why we are listening to this specific podcast.
Oh, right. Like you're setting the stage for a good listening experience?
Exactly. And then, while the students are listening, the book suggests also using different note-taking strategies, maybe mind maps, or even just pausing the podcast and writing a summary about what they all just heard.
Okay.
So it's about taking control of the pace and making sure your students are really digesting the information.
Okay, right. And also, what I love about the podcast that you can listen in whatever you want and wherever you want. It's like having a world of knowledge right in your pocket. And also, this book has some really creative ideas for like actually using using a podcast in the classroom?
Yeah, for example, one of the things Sewa suggests in her section is having students to turn a traditional play into an audio drama.
That's very cool way to combine literature and technology.
Yeah, and get something to think about it. It's how to convey emotion and build suspense just by using your voice.
Okay, such a creative, very creative. And also she suggests that something called rhetorical analysis, which sounds, I think it's kind of intimidating.
Well, yeah, but it's not as scary as it sounds, right? This rhetorical analysis, students can analyze non-fiction podcasts.
Okay.
They try to identify the key arguments and how are they using the podcast.
Okay. It's like kind of detective work for a language, I think. So it helps them to develop their critical thinking skills and I think understand how knowledge, how a language, can be used to influence and persuade, right?
Right, and it also suggests that having students practice their interviewing skills by recording an interview with someone in their own life.
Okay, such a great idea, I think. That takes the learning outside of the classroom and connects to the real world. And I think it's a great way for students to get out there and learn about their communities and the people around them. And I think speaking of learning, the book doesn't just talk about doing activities with podcasts. It also talks about how to assess what students are actually getting from the podcasts.
Yeah, because you want to make sure that your students are understanding and are applying what they learn. So it's not just about listening for the sake of listening. We want to make sure it's actually sinking in.
Okay.
The book really encourages teachers to think beyond just testing listening comprehension. It's about evaluating critical thinking skills and how they can apply their knowledge in a creative way.
Okay, so instead of just doing a quiz, I think they might have them create their own podcast or designing an infographic based on what they learn, right?
Exactly. Make assessments fun and engaging.
Yes.
This book encourages everyone, not just teachers, to think about how these ideas can be applied in our own lives.
Okay, so could you elaborate what does all this mean?
Yeah, well, I think that it means that podcasts can be a powerful tool for personal and professional growth, no matter if you're a teacher or a student. They are a chance to learn new language. They are a chance to expand our knowledge and to become understanding to other cultures. It's just help us to become better listeners in a world that is constantly trying to grab our attention.
Okay.
And the beautiful part about podcast is something you already say, that they are everywhere. So there is this whole world of knowledge that is waiting to be discovered literally in your fingertips. You just need to play pause and start listening. But remember, it's not just about passive listening. It's about engaging with the material and actively use those strategies and making them your own.
Oh yeah, so we can take the best bits of this book and apply them to our own podcast journey. Okay, sounds really interesting. And for our last section, I want to ask about one thing that really caught my eye. When you talk about the future of podcasts, you talk about AI and VR, right? And they could change the way we listen to podcasts and learn. So could you explain it after we taking a break?
Sure.
Okay guys, welcome back. So thanks for continuing with us in the RI podcast. So I was about to ask Ruth what she wrote about AI and VR in a podcasting. So could you elaborate to our audience? What is it?
Yeah, of course. Well, I wrote about the artificial intelligence powered podcast, and I know that is if you heard that, it's something that kind of looks like something from a sci-fi movie, but I mean, we already have tools that transforms audio into text, and this software is been around for years now, and we started to have this new software where you put text, and this software transforms that text into voices, human-like voices. So now we are talking about podcasts that are fully artificial intelligence made, from the script to the voices. We talk even the possibility of interactive chatbots that engage with learners while they listen to the episode.
So wait, you mean people could listen to a podcast and chat with a bot at the same time?
Well, maybe not now, but we are with how quickly the technology is advancing. I don't think we are like so far from this. And for the VR, like just imagine having VR podcasts where we can have this really immersive experience. Like you put the headset of the VR, and you get transported to the place, the location where the podcast was recorded, or the place what the podcast is talking about, or even you can interact with virtual versions of the host and the guest.
Okay, that would be interesting. So it would be like stepping right into the story and becoming part of the conversation. I think it could change everything, like blurring the lines between the physical and digital world. But are there any potential downsides of all this?
Yeah, but we address this in the book. We bring up some really important questions that I think we need to talk about, like how we make ensure that podcast is being fair, how we prevent bias, and what about data privacy, and what about the content creators and the editors and their fear of being replaced by machines. All of these are like relative good questions, and because it's not just about embracing new technology, we need to be thoughtful and responsible with how we use it. It's about finding the balance between innovation and making that technology serves the humanity and not the other way around.
Okay, so it sounds like the future of podcasting is full of potential, but it's really up to us to shape it, that future, in a way that will benefits everyone.
Yeah.
And on the note, I think it's time to wrap up today's episode. But before we do, I do want to leave you with one final thought, provoking question to ponder. We've talked about how podcasts can bring the world into the classroom. What about bringing the classroom into the podcast?
Wait, what do you mean by that?
Okay, so to connect students with experts from all over the world, to facilitate collaborations across borders, and also even to amplify the student voices on a global stage.
Wow, that's a powerful idea.
It's about empowering students to become active participants in global conversations and to use their voices to make a difference. And recognizing that learning isn't confined to the four walls of a classroom, it's a lifelong journey that can take us anywhere. And podcast can be our guide, our companion, or our inspiration to along the way.
Wow, it's amazing to think about all the ways that podcasts can enrich our lives and connect us with the world, and how we can use podcasts to learn and to grow and to connect and with people and with the world that is around us. Thank you for having me here today,
Okay,
Ilhan.
thank you too. Yeah, it's been a pleasure to having you here, Barat. So thanks for joining me today, and all of you listening out. We'll leave you with these questions to ponder as you continue your own deep dive into ever evolving world podcasts. So, what do you think about today's episode? Are you interested in our book? Tell us more in the comments. Remember, stay creative, keep teaching, and see you next time. Bye.
Bye.
RI Academy Podcast, one student, one creativity.
Hello and welcome to Podcast Power, boosting listening skills in English language teaching. If you're an educator looking for innovative strategies, a language learner wanting to sharpen your skills, or simply just someone curious about the power of podcast in education, you're in the right place. Today in RI Academic Podcast, One Student, One Creativity, we have a beautiful guest, Nuzuliati Nisa Utami.
Hi everyone,
Give a applause, please.
welcome to our podcast.
And of course, our team. There are Saida Saia, Hovifa Indasari, and Ishfajraya Nurbais Adila. Okay, in this podcast, we will diving into the journey of teaching material and development course and incredible potential of podcasts hold for transforming how students develop their listening abilities in English. We will explore creative approaches, share practical tips, and highlight real-world success stories and that showcase why podcasts have become a go-to tool for teachers worldwide. So grab your phones, settle in, and let's embark on this exciting journey in the world of podcast and English language learning. Are you ready? Let's go. Okay, hello Nuzuliati.
Hi, Kak.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yes, of course. It's really great to have you here.
Okay.
I mean, it's really nice here. Look at the lightning, and also everyone that attend, and everyone were also very enthusiastic today. Yeah.
Yes, of course. Okay, before we dive deeper into our discussion, I'd
Okay.
love to hear your perspective.
Okay.
First thing first, let's talk about the journey in teaching material development course. Could you tell me what is the background behind this book making and how you got the idea?
Okay, it's actually not me that got the idea, but our group that got this. First of all, teaching material development. Okay, in this course, we as an educator, I mean the candidate still have to settle down and also to develop something that new in this era, right? You know, in here we know about podcasts, you know, and then we have about the Spotify,
Yeah.
and in that place, we as an educators think about how this platform used by student, and that's why in this TMD material, our group decided to make a book that lead and then can be useful by student or also our teacher, of course.
Okay, so because you want to make the students learn more through podcasts.
Yes,
Right,
that's that's the background why we settle and then make this kind of book.
Okay, thank you, Nuzo. So, what inspired you to explore podcasts as a tool for English language teaching, and what impact that have you seen them have on the students' learning experience so far?
Okay, now talking about the experience in here we talk about the fathers that all the student in here seems like know about podcast, right? But back then several of our not really enjoy about the listening, of course, and also the don't know how to use the platform, might struggle to seek the great material to do the podcast like us today. That's why in here about the experience that you talked about earlier, okay, we have to focus that in this book we guide student or also a teacher on how to make the material in that podcast is enjoyable for everyone. That's it. The experience for it.
Okay, that's such a great point. So you try to make the material is applicable in the classroom. Okay, so let's talk about the practical benefits. One of the key points you said in the book is how podcasts expose learners to different accents. Why is
That's really
accent really
nice.
important?
Well, accent is so much important. We, as a teacher, know about British and also American accent, right?
Yeah.
And it's knowable, and it's already popular among us, the student, also the teacher. But in reality, we seek another accents, right? Like Nigerian accent and also the Australian accent. In here, I want in this book, we also provide some of the tips how you choose the material based on your accent, and of course on how this accent is suitable for the learning enjoyment.
All right. So accent is always the thing that really interesting when we learn new language, right?
Yes,
So
of
do you
course.
have any specific podcast or genre you recommend for this kind of exposure, like accent?
Okay, about accent and also genre of the podcast. Well, definitely, I have some of the recommendation when you want to focus on the storytelling from the over the world. You can seek BBC Global News. It's mixed English and also American, and also it's based on international English language. And also, if you uh, have intention to something lighter, you might seek Luke's English podcast because it's great to mix from British into spare of the humor into the podcast.
Okay, great suggestion. And what about the learners that struggle with fast speech or complex vocabulary? You know,
okay.
sometimes podcasts they talk faster
Yes,
than
of course.
students, and they use any words that maybe aren't familiar with the students. How?
Okay. Yes, that's also a struggle if you are learning from podcasts. Well, in this book, we actually have a tips to maintain this kind of the problem. One, we know in every podcast we have speed point or speed dialogue. Okay. Now we have also feedback speed feature to slow things down. Now let's say, don't be hesitate to slow down things. Moreover, if the podcast is enjoyable or it contains some the knowledge that you need, because many podcast apps allow that, and it's okay to do. Also, try to listen in different stages, maybe a length of the time, and also the subject of the podcast. You have to manage what kind of podcast that you try to understand it. And also, we know script. Every podcast or some of the podcasts, I mean, also provide some script. You also can see it. I think that's
Okay.
some of the tips how you overcome these challenges for the
Okay,
speech.
so the thing is we don't have to hesitate to play back, like
Yes.
play this video slowly if we got lost in the translation.
Because
Okay.
that's some of the student like I will skip this part.
Yes.
I will go to that part that is really easier one. No, we are not doing that because, well, you know, it's not simple. Okay, it's not that simple to skip the podcast, right? There is a segment that you must pay attention that might. That's the point, and you lose it if you speed your podcast, right?
All right. So I love that podcasts are so versatile, but let's shift to the classroom for a moment. How can teachers incorporate podcasts into their lessons?
Okay. So there are several ways, I think. One of the favorite activity is using podcast for fill in the blank. Now, so in podcast, it's contain audio and also a written. Okay. In fill the blank in here might be help student to improve their speaking and also their writing test. For example, I'll play short segment like here. Give student a transcript with missing part in the script, and after that, the student will be filling the script. That is also helpful for student.
Yeah, I agree. So that's such a fun idea, actually. But what about the individual learners? Any specific techniques they can try on their own?
Okay. In our book, we have I don't know if it is the which chapter that will be, but in the book we specifically talk about shadowing in fantastic technique. So it's when you listen podcast and repeat what speakers say in real life time. So you are mimicking speaker when speakers say, "Oh, you are damsel in distress." Oh, you can also use that in the real life. You know what we don't know, right? What is the damsel in distress? Well, damsel in distress mean you are struggle to do things. That is shadowing actually. You are mimicking some segment or word that made by podcaster.
I love that simple but effective. Shadowing, summarizing, and filling in the blanks. These are gold. Do you have a go-to podcast for beginners?
Okay, for beginners, right? So in our book, in I think it's chapter 11 until 12, it's also divided into some of the segment for the listening process. Listening podcast is also have a type of learner. Such for the beginner, I recommend the ESL podcast or the English of We Speak from the BBC. They are designed to be understandable in every aspect of or in every level students.
All right. That can be the references for the students and teacher, of course. All right, guys, before we continue to the next segment, let's have a coffee break, and we'll be right back. Okay, we're back, and we will continue to a next segment. It's about overcoming challenges. Let's address the elephant in the room. What about learners who find listening to podcasts overwhelming? Any advice for overcoming that hurdle?
Oh yeah, overwhelm, challenge, of course, will be faced when you are learning from podcasts. So, in here, my advice is to start from the small. Choose podcasts with shorter episode, okay, which maybe contain some 10 or 12 episodes that sum up of the idea. And also, if you stick to that part, I think you will be good enough to do that. And also, set the realistic goal. Don't try to understand. Try to understand every single word and focus on the main idea first.
All right.
This is my advice.
All right. That's a good advice, actually. We have to start everything from a small step and always be consistent. Okay. Well, this has been an insightful conversation, Julia. Before we wrap up, any final tips for our listeners?
Yes. So, make podcast by habits. Okay. By being daily, and then make sure you have spare time to listen some of the podcasts. It will help you to understand how the speaker doing the step by step, and also how they are and how they are explain the material. And if you do that time, by the time you will understand longer podcast with longer episode.
Right. Practice makes perfect, right? What wise words. Thank you so much for
You're
joining us,
welcome.
Nuzul. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, it's really nice to hear. Thank you for having me, because this is really a nice podcast in here.
All right. Thank you so much. And thank you for listeners for tuning into our podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode with a friend who's learning English. Until next time, keep listening and keep growing. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
RI Academy Podcast, one student, one creativity. RI Academy Podcast, one student, one creativity.
Hello everyone, welcome back to RI Academy Podcast, one student, one creativity. Let me introduce myself first. My name is Rita as a host, and now we are going to talk about a new way to teach English with our special guest, Nur Latifa, a student coming from Sriwijaya University. Hi Nur Latifa.
Hello, Sinta. How are you?
I'm fine, good, nice to meet you. Thank you already coming here.
Nice to meet you too. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'm really looking forward to discuss how podcast can be useful to teach, give a new way to teach English.
Absolutely. Thank you already having a conversation with me. So take a look at right now in the new era. Podcast is very familiar right now in teach English. But I think right now to discuss about podcast, how a new way to teach English for teachers and also, but I think many people are still wondering about that. How can exactly podcast help us to teach English?
Absolutely, that's a great question. So there are so many ways podcasts can be useful in teaching English. First, because podcasts offer real life listening practice. So the learners can hear directly from the speaker talk about the short topics in natural conversation, so that the student can get new accent, different culture, and also another thing that they not get from the traditional textbooks.
I love that idea. So it sounds like podcasts give learners a change to their life right now. But I wanna more to know how can teachers actually use podcasts in their lesson.
So teacher can use podcasts in different ways. For example, teacher can play podcasts for students to listen to, and then ask simple questions to check their understanding, and it helps students to improve their listening skills. And teachers also can ask students to explain what they heard or talk about the ideas in the podcast, and it helps students to think critically and practice their speaking even their writing. And another way to use podcasts is the teacher can ask students to listen to specific phrases to the new vocabulary.
That's a great idea. Podcasts can help with listening, speaking, writing, and vocabulary for the students. They make learning more interesting and active when they are by using podcasts. But I think there might be some challenges in using podcasts in learning in learning. Do you think there are any difficulties that might face by teachers?
Yes, definitely. One challenge is access to technology, because not all of students have the device or internet. So it's important to make sure that everyone can join. But this is less of a problem right now, because everyone is having a smartphone already. And then another challenge is picking right podcast, because some podcasts are too hard, or some may be too easy. So it is important for teacher to pick which one is the match podcast for student to keep student engaged and interested. And also, podcasts are often casual and they don't always follow grammar rules, which can be confusing for a beginner.
RI Academy Podcast, one student, one creativity.
for students might take time when they watch a podcast. And also podcast can make learning fun and interactive for the student. Could you share some tips for us as a teacher who are new to teach English by using podcasts?
One tip is to keep it short. So you can make the podcast not longer than 5 until 10 minutes. Short episodes are easier to manage and keep the student engaged. And then encourage active listening by giving student a task like finding specific information from the podcast. It is give the student pressure to keep listening to the podcast, and then this helps them to stay focused. And you can also use group work by having students on the podcast. Finally, you can also make it fun. This is the important thing, because podcast not only about studying. You can also serve like a story or even about another culture.
Great tips, Nur Latifa. So I like how you focus on your tips. For example, make it short and then fun. Podcast can make learning and starting more enjoyable for the students, and especially if student interactive with the content of the podcast that they watch. So I think many teachers will want to try this idea. One more question: what would you say is the biggest benefit of using podcast in teaching English?
Biggest benefit of podcast is their flexibility, because students can hear the podcast in their own pace, whether in class or on the go. And podcast also lets students hear different accent, different culture, different language style, and then which can always provide by the textbooks. And they make learning easier and relaxed, and helping students to enjoy the process. And podcasts are a great way to improve language skills and learn about different culture.
I completely agree with what you already say. Podcast seems like a great way to improve the language of the students and make it more fun and interactive. Thank you, Nur Latifa, for sharing the idea with us today. And I'm sure the listener are excited to try podcast in teaching English, especially as new teachers.
Thank you, Sinta. It is such a pleasure to be on the podcast. I hope everyone is excited to try out the podcast in their process of learning and teaching, and I'm sure it will bring a lot of value to your students.
Okay, well, you are welcome, Nur Latifa. Thank you for all the listeners for joining us today, and we hope this talk about using podcast is a new way to teach English. Will help all the teachers around the world to teach the students. Don't forget, stay tuned for our videos in the next videos. See you!
RI Academy Podcast, one student, one creativity.